So after his famous debate with Billy Carson, which landed him on Joe Rogan's podcast, where they discussed a number of topics from atheism, the historicity of Jesus, including his death and resurrection, the historical validity of the Gospels, Wes Huff invited a number of critics. And one of the most notable critics is Alex O'Connor. Now, unlike Billy Carson, who I absolutely knew nothing about, Alex O'Connor is someone that I'm familiar with. In fact, I'm a subscriber to his channel, The Cosmic Skeptic, where he hosts a podcast called Within Reason. Now, Alex, being an atheist, has had a number of discussions with notable Christian apologists and theologians such as William Lane Craig, Cliff, and Stuart Knachtel. So as a reaction to Wes Huff's appearance on Joe Rogan's podcast, he's released a critique titled How Wes Huff Got the Bible Wrong on Joe Rogan. However, it appears that even in his own comment section, Alex has received a number of criticism from people saying that he took a lot of Wes's points out of context, that he provided very shallow research, that he was incredibly biased. And even though I personally think that Alex usually is within reason and that he does very good takes and he's careful, but I do agree with the majority that in this particular critique, he was incredibly biased, especially given that he omitted a lot of good points that Wes Huff made, and he didn't address, the challenge to atheism that both actually Rogan and Wes made together. Now, there have been a number of Christian theologians and apologists who have come into Wes's defense. And in this particular video, we're going to focus on two of those takes. One by Garvin Ertland, who has a YouTube channel called Truth Unites, and the other one will be the collaborative effort of Sean McDowell and no other than William Lane Craig. Three of these men do a great job of addressing Alex's objections to Wes. So let's get into it. So the first objection that Alex O'Connor makes has to do with the Isaiah Dead Sea Scroll. It seems like rather than focusing on how incredibly of a find the Isaiah Dead Sea Scroll is, Alex chose to critique Wes Huff, where he said this is a word-for-word translation from our latest text. And I absolutely love what Garvin Ertland has to say about this.
How similar is it to the book of Isaiah that's in the Bible?
So that one is fascinating. So this isn't true for all of the Dead Sea Scrolls, but when we discovered the Great Isaiah Scroll, previous to that, the earliest copy of Isaiah that we had was in the Masoretic text, which is in the Middle Ages.
Whoa.
Yeah, so it was literally 1,000 years. We literally pushed back our understanding of Isaiah 1,000 years. And the thing that really shocked scholars, like I said, this isn't true for all of the Dead Sea Scrolls, but one of the things that shocked them about Isaiah was that it was word for word identical to the Masoretic text.
Word for word?
Word for word.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow, that would be amazing if it were true. In fact, the Dead Sea version of the Isaiah scroll is not quite identical to the Masoretic text, that is, the one that we know from the Bible. Can you guess how many textual variants there are between the two? Take a guess. 1 that Wes forgot about? 10? 100? Try more than 2,600.
But it needs to be emphasized that the majority of these discrepancies are about tiny issues like spelling, not even necessarily errors of spelling, just differences. One scholar notes that these variations are mostly occasioned by considerations of orthography. Orthography is the conventional spelling system of a particular language, kind of like how Americans might use this spelling, color, C-O-L-O-R, but the British people weirdly put a U in that word. The Great Isaiah Scroll, it's under discussion here, contains spellings that reflect its own historical context. So that wouldn't affect the word-for-word claim that Wes made. Word for word doesn't necessarily mean word for identically spelled word. So the 2,600 figure here is potentially very misleading for onlookers. Now, to his credit, Alex acknowledges that most of these variations are very small.
Then Alex also makes a point that there were parts missing in the Isaiah Dead Sea Scroll. But it also seems that he missed a very important point that Garvin Ertland makes.
Most of these variants are small. There are differences in spelling, for example, but some of them are more significant. For instance, in Isaiah chapter 2, the end of verse 9 and all of verse 10 are simply missing from the Dead Sea version. They're just not there.
He proceeds to quote from the Digital Dead Sea Scrolls project to buttress this point, and he's correct about the scroll in question. However, there are multiple scrolls of Isaiah found among the Dead Sea Scrolls in these different caves at Qumran, and one scroll is nearly complete, that's the Great Isaiah Scroll, but there's many other fragmentary texts. The same website that Alex quotes from to get the 2,600 figure also notes around 20 additional copies of the book of Isaiah were found there. And in other manuscripts, that part of Isaiah 2:9 and Isaiah 2:10 are included. And that again is noted from the same website that Alex quoted from.
Now, the second objection that Alex makes is he has a problem with the lack of explicit divine claims of Jesus in the Gospel of Mark, which is our first written gospel. and it is our earliest account. So he takes an issue with that, even though Wes was not necessarily emphasizing the point. This was really confusing to me because clearly if you read the book of Mark, you see that the whole reason why Jesus gets crucified is because he claims to be God. So let's hear what William Lane Craig and Sean McDowell have to say about this, as well as what Artland says about this, because I clearly see that Jesus claiming divinity in the book of Mark.
Wes says that Jesus was audaciously going around claiming to be God himself.
Walking around first century Roman-occupied Judea, he's making some pretty audacious claims to be God himself, and then he predicts his own death and resurrection.
I don't think that's true. Nowhere in Mark, Matthew, or Luke does Jesus actually claim to be God in his own words. At best, it's just in John's Gospel that divine claims begin to appear. I and the Father are one. Whoever has seen me has seen the Father. Before Abraham was, ego eimi. I actually still don't think even these count, and we'll explain why in another video, but let's just say that they do. Even if this was Jesus explicitly claiming to be God, don't you think it's a bit suspicious that these claims only show up in our latest Gospel? If Jesus was known to be walking around claiming explicitly to be God himself, did the other 3 Gospel authors just not think this was relevant? A minor, unimportant detail not worth including?
Essentially, here's the key question I'd love for you to weigh in on, Bill. To confidently believe that Jesus is God, do we need explicit first-person claims? And did Jesus adequately claim to be God in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which came before John?
In my published work, I've tried to show that historically, Jesus of Nazareth made highly significant Christological claims about himself, whereby he put himself in the place of God himself. For example, he claimed to be the long-awaited Jewish Messiah. He claimed to be the Son of God in a unique sense. He claimed to be the divine human Son of Man prophesied by the prophet Daniel. And all of these offices or titles come together at the trial scene in Mark's Gospel. The high priest, the leader of the Sanhedrin, charges Jesus under oath, "Are you the Christ? Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" And Jesus responds, "I am. And you shall see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." A virtual quotation from Daniel 7. So here you see claims that assert the divinity of Jesus by use of these significant Christological titles. And immediately the high priest and the Sanhedrin recognized the blasphemy of what he had said and condemned him to death. Now, in addition to these explicit claims, there are also implicit Christological claims that Jesus made, whereby he put himself in God's place. For example, his claim to be able to forgive sins. In Mark chapter 2, we have the story of the healing of the paralytic. Jesus says to the man, "My son, your sins are forgiven." And Mark records that those standing about murmured and said, "Who does this man think he is? No one can forgive sins but God alone." And Jesus, knowing what they're saying, says, "Which do you think is easier? To say your sins are forgiven, or rise, get up, and take your bed and go home?" And he says, "That you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins." He says to the paralytic, "I say to you, rise, get up, and go home." And the man is miraculously healed. Clearly in Mark's Gospel, this is a claim to divinity, exercising authority to forgive sins, an authority and prerogative that belong to God alone.
And Garvin Artland adds to this point.
Now, it's not necessarily surprising that the way Jesus claims to be God in Matthew, Mark, and Luke will look a little different from how he claims to be God in John, because everything in Matthew, Mark, and Luke is a little different from the Gospel of John. Nonetheless, there is substantial evidence from these first 3 Gospels that Jesus did claim to be God. First of all, he receives worship, which is a significant point of testimony. Second of all, the whole plot of these Gospels is getting crucified for blasphemy. That's the whole narrative that drives everything. And at the start of Mark's Gospel, you have the Pharisees saying, "Who has authority to forgive sins but God alone?" And Jesus is responding saying, "I have that authority." At the end of Mark's Gospel, Jesus claims to be the figure of Daniel 7, who has divine authority to judge the world. Here's the thing, is that a passage like that, this is why I emphasize the Jewish context and the context of ministry. Jesus didn't come into the world just to teach systematic theology. He's doing ministry, but we may not realize the significance of what he's saying from Daniel 7, but his contemporaries did. You can see their response there. I'll put the text back up there. They're tearing their clothes and crucifying him for blasphemy here.
Now, the third objection that Alex makes, he seems to have a problem with the lack of resurrection appearances in the book of Mark. So the earliest manuscripts of the book of Mark, specifically chapter 16, verses 9 to 20, they're kind of omitted. We don't have those verses in our earliest manuscripts. So let me read to you how chapter 16 ends without verses 9 to 20. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in white robe sitting at the right side, and they were alarmed. "Don't be alarmed," he said. "You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified and has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go tell his disciples and Peter, he's going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you." Trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. So Alex makes a point that because we don't have resurrection appearances in our earliest gospels, that somehow it invalidates the resurrection of Jesus. Even though the book of Mark does end on the fact that Jesus died and resurrected, the women at the tomb were instructed to tell the disciples of the fact that the tomb was empty and to go to Galilee. So I'm not really sure what point Alex is making to say that, just because we don't have those, earlier resurrection appearances, in our earliest manuscript, even though the other gospels further elaborate, and even if these resurrection appearances are missing from the book of Mark, I think the point that Wes Huff was actually making is the fact that how close of a window we have here, the fact that, the gospels were written so closely to the facts, when most of historical accounts, there are literally centuries that pass before a historical account is written about a persona, kind of like with Alexander the Great, and William Lane Craig makes this point here.
But the Gospels are written in the lifetime of the eyewitnesses, and they're written in this period of time where you have groups of individuals who could have fact-checked those things.
Okay, it gets a bit speculative here. Scholarly consensus is that the earliest gospel, Mark, was written around 70 AD. This is some 40 years after Jesus died, and likely after the death of most of the eyewitnesses, given life expectancy in the ancient world. But even if it were written earlier, even if it were written by Mark himself, we're talking about the resurrection here. And notice that the earliest version of Mark's gospel does not contain any descriptions of post-resurrection appearances. It ends with the empty tomb and a disappeared Jesus, and suggests that he will appear to people, but it doesn't record those appearances. So even if it's written by an eyewitness, it doesn't report anything about the resurrected Jesus. The most numerous and detailed post-resurrection appearances of Jesus are in the fourth gospel, the Gospel of John. Scholarly consensus states this to somewhere between 90 and 100 AD.
Now, there's a decent amount of back and forth here, Bill, and a lot of things we could unpack and discuss, but here's kind of the key question I'd love for you to weigh in on. What do we make of the lack of the resurrection appearances in Mark, and then the numerous and detailed appearances in John? And then if you like, we can come back to it, but are the Gospels written in the lifetime of eyewitnesses who could have actually fact-checked them?
Mark clearly knows of resurrection appearances of Jesus in Galilee, for he has the angel say to the women at the empty tomb, "Go and tell Peter and his disciples that he is going before you into Galilee. There you will see him." So if Mark's gospel does end at chapter 16, verse 8, Mark doesn't care to tell us the story of that appearance, but he knows of such a Galilean appearance. Now, in Matthew's gospel, Matthew does provide such a story of the appearance to the disciples in Galilee. So I'm not really sure what Alex's point here is supposed to be. Mark's gospel provides very early testimony to the facts of Jesus' empty tomb, to an appearance of Jesus to the disciples in Galilee, and to the origin of the disciples' belief in Jesus' resurrection. So what's the problem? I don't think that Alex appreciates how incredibly narrow the window of opportunity is for legend to arise. Consider by contrast, the earliest biographies of Alexander the Great were written by Arrian and Plutarch some 400 years after Alexander's death. And yet classical historians still regard these as largely reliable accounts of the life and doings of Alexander. By contrast, in the Gospels, here we have narratives of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection within the first generation after his death. This is far too narrow a window of opportunity for significant accrual of legend in this regard, while eyewitnesses were still alive and the apostles were in control of the testimony of Jesus.
The fact that these accounts are written within the first generation of Jesus's life and death and resurrection, that's incredible. That is such a rare thing, especially in ancient history. So the fourth objection that Alex makes, he seems to take an issue when Wes Huff says that, non-canonical, the Gnostic texts had an agenda. And so Alex makes this very weird point and says, well, stop, Wes. What do you mean an agenda? Isn't that what the canonical gospels have, an agenda? But what Alex seems to completely leave out is the fact that there's two different agendas. The Gnostic gospels misrepresent the historical Jesus, while the canonical gospel, because they were written in the right time, not the second century that the Gnostic gospels were written, but still in the first century, unless you want to have a debate about the book of John. But, the fact that these canonical gospels present a real historical Jesus, they have a right representation of Jesus, versus the Gnostic gospels that are really out there and misrepresent. They sort of have pagan main themes, and they sort of use Jesus as a puppet to their own different non-historical, non-Jewish representation of Jesus. It was really weird. It was really weird when Alex made this point, because I'm like, what do you mean? And Alex seemed to completely not play the parts where Wes Huff further elaborates why we consider the canonical gospels to be reliable versus the non-canonical gospels.
There are dozens of non-canonical gospels that were written but didn't make it into the New Testament for all kinds of different reasons. Listen to what Wes Huff has to say about these gospels.
And so these books that were not included, are any of them interesting? I mean,
they're all interesting.
But does any of it seem like it belongs in the New Testament?
Well, so part of the problem with some of these other books is they appear to be almost completely reliant on the other books. So you do have, and some of them have an agenda to them.
Like what? I'm just going to underline that. He just said of the non-canonical gospels.
Part of the problem with some of these other books is they appear to be almost completely reliant on the other books.
The problem here is with basically the first thing that anybody learns about the New Testament. Scholars think that Mark was written first, then Matthew and Luke were written later. Why? Because Matthew and Luke are reliant on Mark, and not just a little bit. More than 90% of Mark's gospel is also in Matthew's gospel. Mark has 660 verses in total. Over 600 of them are also in Matthew, often copied verbatim. It is undisputed that there is a literary dependence between Matthew and Luke and Mark.
Again, there's a lot here, Bill, but here's the question I'd love for you to weigh in on. Is Wes right that we can dismiss the Gnostic Gospels for having an agenda and for being reliant upon earlier Gospels? What should we make of the Gnostic Gospels?
Here, I think that Alex is needlessly unsympathetic to what Wes Huff was saying. The apocryphal gospels, things like the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of Philip, and so on, do not appear until the second half of the second century after Christ, and they are shaped by the pagan philosophy of Gnosticism. They do not evince a genuine historical interest in Jesus of Nazareth. Rather, Jesus simply serves as a kind of sock puppet, a mouthpiece for spouting Gnostic doctrine. What historical nuggets the apocryphal gospels do contain all come from the New Testament, which they know. So the apocryphal gospels are not useful as sources for the life and teachings of Jesus. Now, again, I want to ask, what is Alex's point supposed to be? Surely he doesn't think that the apocryphal gospels are reliable sources. Rather, he must think that Wes Huff's critique is correct, but that it would also invalidate the New Testament gospels. But that inference, I think, is far too quick. Of course, the New Testament Gospels have an agenda. And of course, there are relations of dependency between them.
And I love how William Lane Craig, further illuminates what this codependence of the gospel is. Even though, they're codependent, they all have differences in how they describe the events, which tells you that each writer has a unique perspective to the same event.
Nevertheless, they do provide early, multiple, independent attestation to many aspects of the life of Jesus, and therefore are generally regarded as valuable historical sources for the life of Christ. To give just one illustration, take the burial narrative of Jesus, such an important event, the burial in the tomb. This is attested in the pre-Markan Passion story that Mark used in writing his gospel. It is also to be found in Matthew's special source material, that is to say, material that Matthew had that he did not derive from Mark. And it's also found in Luke's special material, that is material unique to Luke, which he did not derive from Mark or from Matthew. And then the story is also found in the Gospel of John, which is generally regarded as independent of the three synoptics. Go over to the Apostle Paul, and you find the burial mentioned in the very old tradition handed down by Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, 3-5. And on top of all that, the burial account is mentioned in the apostolic sermons in the Acts of the Apostles. So look what we've got here. You've got 5 or 6 independent sources for the burial account, some of which are among the most ancient, earliest materials in the New Testament. And so these are incomparably better sources than the 2nd century apocryphal gospel.
Now, the fifth objection that we're going to focus on that Alex makes, he makes a lot more, but is the fact that he has an issue with the resurrection witnesses mentioned in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, which Paul wrote about the people who saw Jesus. So this is the passage. 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3-9. For what I have received, I pass on to you as of first importance, that Jesus Christ died for our sin according to the scriptures, that he was buried, and that he was raised on the 3rd day according to the scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, and then to the 12, and that he appeared more than 500 of brothers and sisters at the same time, most of whom who are still living, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all he appeared to me as to one abnormally born. For I am the least of the apostles, and do not even deserve to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God. And he specifically has a problem with all at once 500 appearance. He says that this is the only time that it's mentioned. It's not mentioned anywhere else in the Gospels. And here's something to note, that 1 Corinthians was written by Paul in 50 AD, which is even earlier than Mark's gospel, which is estimated to be 70 AD. So it's an even earlier account by Paul. That in itself is incredible. But, Alex hyper focuses on these 500, and he sort of talks about the above, was it meant above as above them, or above like more than? He goes into that word, but he kind of misses the bigger context of that whole chapter and how incredibly significant it is. And I love the critique that both Ortlund gives and William Lane Craig gives on this specific point.
How many people saw his body, right?
Well, Paul says that 400 people saw him all at once.
400 people.
And obviously Wes meant not 400, but 500.
400 people saw the crucifixion.
No, saw the resurrected Jesus. Yeah, 1 Corinthians 15. Paul says that Jesus appeared to the disciples, and then he appeared to 400 people all at once.
Wes gets this slightly wrong, as Paul actually says that Jesus appeared to 500, not 400 people at one time, but this only makes it all the more amazing. 500 people witnessing the physically resurrected Jesus would be an amazing proof of his resurrection. Unfortunately, 1 Corinthians chapter 15 is the only mention we have of this event anywhere. It's not in the Gospels, nor in Acts, nor in any other historical source. So, what do we learn about this event from 1 Corinthians? Nothing. Nothing at all.
After this, Alex goes on to emphasize how little we know about this event, and he argues that the term more than or over in 1 Corinthians 15:6 perhaps means over them, as in the sky above. But even if we granted that, that doesn't really seem to move the needle too much. We can just say, fine, okay, for the sake of argument, we could say it's not more than 500, it's just 500. Two observations. First, West didn't place a ton of weight on that one particular point. This was just one piece of data that was given in response to Joe's question about how many people saw Jesus. Second of all, Paul's testimony should not be written out of court simply because he doesn't give us any details about all these appearances. Remember that Paul is writing this letter in the early 50s AD. This is from 1 Corinthians, so written around somewhere early 50s, and he's likely quoting an even earlier tradition in this passage in 1 Corinthians 15. So we are within 2 decades of Jesus' death. Some scholars make the argument that it's implausible that Paul would fabricate an appearance to hundreds of people at a time when there's ample opportunity for fact-checking. And people can say, where is Paul getting this? But even if you throw out verse 6, okay, take the reference to I worry here that the focus is getting put so much on these 500 people, this appearance, that the rest of Paul, and even the rest of 1 Corinthians 15, is sort of getting overlooked here. We have to work through the other people mentioned in this passage and in other passages in Paul. Paul is identifying by name eyewitnesses of the resurrection, like James, the other apostles, himself. And this is happening within living memory of the ministry of Christ. That is the important point that I took West to be making.
William Lane Craig makes excellent points about this 500 appearance.
Question is, I'm really curious your take on how valuable, central, and reliable is the appearance to the 500 as cited by Paul in the 1 Corinthians 15 creed?
Certainly, it would be very nice to have multiple attestation of this appearance, but it would be a misuse of the criteria of authenticity to say that because the appearance is not multiply attested, therefore it is unhistorical. The criteria of authenticity, like multiple attestation, dissimilarity, and so forth, can only be used positively to increase the probability of some event. But obviously, being singly attested does not imply that the event, therefore, did not occur. In fact, I think that we have really good grounds for thinking that the appearance to the 500 brethren did occur, because Paul goes on to say of the 500 brethren, most of whom are still alive, though some have died. That shows that this appearance was not just a meaningless cipher for Paul. Rather, he knew the people involved, and he was aware that some of them had passed away in the interim. Paul's mentioning that some of them are still alive can only mean the witnesses are there to be questioned. Now, why don't we have then an appearance or a story of this appearance? Well, think about it with me. An appearance to 500 people at one time would have to take place out of doors. For example, perhaps on a Galilean hillside where thousands of people had gathered to hear Jesus preach during his lifetime. The Gospels tend to focus their attention on the resurrection appearances in Jerusalem as opposed to Galilee. But a provocative suggestion is that the mountaintop appearance in Galilee, narrated by Matthew, could be the appearance to the 500 brethren. One of the interesting things about Matthew's appearance story is that unlike all the other appearances, which were unexpected and caught people by surprise, is that this one was by appointment. Matthew says the disciples went to the mountain which Jesus had appointed them to go to, and there he appeared to them. And it was, of course, in Galilee that thousands of people had thronged to hear Jesus. I think it's not at all improbable that 500 people might have gathered with the disciples on that mountaintop to wait for Jesus and to experience this appearance. And so it could be that we do actually have a mention of this appearance story in the Galilean appearance story in Matthew.
As a whole, my take is there's multiple appearance accounts. We have different accounts to the women. We have accounts to the two disciples in Luke 24, the Emmaus disciples. We have multiple also accounts to the disciples with Thomas, without Thomas, James, Paul, etc. And we have the 500. So it's a piece of a cumulative case. And we can make, I think Alex goes too far in saying, what do we learn from this event? Nothing
Right.
at all. I think that's too skeptical. I don't think Wes, I think he was just simply citing this as, hey, do we have appearances of Jesus? Here's one example. Would have given others. So we can be too critical, but we can also be too confident in it. To me, it's a piece of a larger case that just strengthens the appearances of Jesus.
Then Alex has further problems with the 500 appearance.
And even if the 500 people did all believe it was Jesus, how many of them were already predisposed to think this? Remember, sometimes groups do claim to see visions, such as various apparitions of Mary, or the Roman Emperor Constantine's vision of a cross of light in the sky, which may have been seen by his whole army as well. The source isn't clear. Look at this image. This is a picture of a crowd in Fatima, Portugal in 1917. This crowd, many more than 500 in number, were witness to the so-called miracle of the sun. A prophecy by 3 shepherd children said that the Virgin Mary would perform a miracle on the 13th of October, causing this large crowd to gather on that day. And the miracle happened. Testimonies from the members in the crowd were published in the newspaper. They claimed to have seen the sun dancing in the sky, zigzagging around, and even advancing towards the earth.
And Alex makes this point that, these people were predisposed to see, Mary perform this miracle. So how do we know that the 500 were not predisposed to see the resurrected Christ? But the thing of it is, and I love this point by William Lane Craig,
these early appearances were completely contrary to antecedent Jewish beliefs, which predisposed them not to believe that Jesus was risen from the dead. One of the most remarkable things about the belief in the resurrection of Jesus is that the earliest disciples who suddenly and sincerely came to this belief were predisposed by their first century typical Jewish thought forms completely against it. And so this is one of the major factors crying out for explanation with respect to the resurrection of Jesus. What N.T. Wright has called these mutations in Jewish belief about the resurrection that were necessitated by believing in Jesus rising from the dead. This is not a natural evolution of antecedent Judaism.
Now, if I understand Alex's reasoning correctly, he's saying, if we have this appearance of the 500, then we would need to adopt these Catholic visions of Mary. And since many people don't accept those, we should question the 500. I would say, well, all right, if we accept the 500 and be consistent in his eyes and accept the Marian apparitions, then you and I, Bill, would just need to maybe consider becoming Catholic, but he would need to completely shift his worldview and open it up to the supernatural, which would be far more jarring to him than it would be to you and me. But nonetheless, I think you're absolutely right. The predisposition changes everything.
Then Alex has an objection with Paul's account of the post-resurrected Christ.
Paul never claims to have encountered the physically resurrected Jesus. Even his conversion story in Acts just describes him seeing a flash of light and hearing the voice of Christ while on the road to Damascus. He never even claimed to meet the risen Jesus in the flesh, which I think is what Rogan is looking for here.
And it's really weird that Alex makes this point that Paul didn't see Jesus in the flesh. The thing of it is, how could Jesus have a flesh body post-resurrected? The point that Alex makes is very weird because clearly Paul has an encounter with Jesus and that he does see him. Obviously he's not in the flesh, but I believe he sees a figure of Jesus and he knows it is Jesus. There's a voice, there's clear instructions. It says, Paul, why are you persecuting me? And just to discount this whole, account by Paul on his road to Damascus, which he completely changes his life. He goes from literally going to kill Christians to now becoming a convert and going on mission. And then the fact that all the apostles died martyr deaths, for what they believe. Anyway, let's go into what actually William Lane Craig and Sean McDowell have to say about these points, with Paul.
His experience is recounted 3 times in the book of Acts and is confirmed by Paul's references to it in his own undisputed letters. Now, I'm not really sure what Alex means by seeing Jesus in the flesh, since it's the testimony of the New Testament that a resurrection body is radically different than our present mortal bodies. I think that the question is whether Paul saw simply a blinding light and heard the the voice of Christ speaking to him, or whether he saw the bodily form of a person who spoke to him. And it's really hard to know exactly what Paul said. The evidence is not clear. But when Paul says elsewhere in 1 Corinthians, have I not seen Jesus, our Lord? He uses exactly the same language that is used to describe the bodily appearances of Jesus to the other disciples. And so I think it's not at all unlikely. In fact, I'm kind of leaning in the direction of thinking that what Paul saw was the bodily image of a man in that blinding light that was the Lord Jesus.
And my question is like, Alex, why would Paul lie? Why would Paul, somebody who literally died for their faith, gave their whole life 100% to the mission, and then died as a martyr, why on earth would Paul, 50 AD, in the letter to Corinthians, lie? What kind of motives would he have? I mean, it just makes no sense. All right, guys, so I hope you enjoyed this video. I think overall, Wes did very well in Joe Rogan's podcast. There was multiple opportunities for Alex to actually address a lot of the conversation points that Rogan and Wes had about atheism, but seems like Alex completely, like for instance, they talk about how is it that atheists have no problem believing in the virgin birth of the universe, but they have a problem with the virgin birth of Jesus. I wish that Alex, given his worldview, elaborated in his critique, but he completely omits that. Anyway, I hope that Alex, has one of these, C.S. Lewis moments where, he goes from atheism to belief in Christ. Even atheism doesn't really stand alone. It literally is a reactionary religion, I would say. It's literally built on nothing and pure speculation. Hyper-skepticism, that's what's so amazing. It's like, would we really have atheists without Christianity? I mean, obviously there's other religions, but the thing of the matter is like, atheists especially hate Christianity, because why? Because there's actual historical evidence for it. You can sort of bluff off other religions because there's not such an ample body of historical literature like Christianity has. And that's what actually makes Christianity so different than other world religions. You know what I mean? Anyway, like I said, I just hope that Alex, really, I pray for him. And I hope that one day, he's very young. He's like only 25, I believe. But honestly, maybe when he's like 40 or something, he's going to be a devout Christian. You just never know. You never know. All right, guys, thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you were encouraged as a Christian to know that you have a faith that is really based in history and truth. And that should be incredibly encouraging, give you a great confidence as we minister to people about the glory and the beauty of Jesus, who died for our sins, who made us as new creations, in whom we have hope. Just like he resurrected, we will have a new body. We're going to be with him. There's going to be the Feast of the Lamb. We have great things to look forward. All right, guys, thank you so much for watching this video. Consider liking, commenting, and subscribing to my channel. I will greatly appreciate it. And I'll see you guys in the next video.